you very much indeed, Paul, and for those of you that haven't seen me before, I apologise. Usually when I meet people, having been heard on the radio, their first observation is that I should be taller than I actually am. It's why I'm sitting down this afternoon. Equally, to those of you who might have been slightly misled by something that is in the programme this afternoon, Malcolm Arnold's Northampton is not an illustrated architectural tour of a county town. Not until next year. We might work on that one. This instead is something rather different. My background was actually in the world of classical music as a tiny, tiny boy. They discovered here in Northampton that I'd got a voice, and ultimately that took me to Cambridge as a boy chorister, where I had the most wonderful education, learning about all kinds of music, secular and ecclesiastical. It gave me an appreciation for music and, by extension, therefore, an appreciation of some of the music of Malcolm Arnold, much of which I've come to know in the work that Paul Harris and I have been doing on the next hour or so. And I must thank Paul and his team and all the guys who've helped me put together what hopefully will be the fastest run around 9 symphonies that you will experience this side of Christmas. I know it's been quite an amazing weekend already. There is, of course, the gala concert to come, and the 9th. And hopefully, by the end of this afternoon, I could perhaps pose of you a question mark as to whether or not this weekend we've discovered something that might not have been known about the 9th and what followed it. But I'll come to that in a little while. So, 9 symphonies delivered over 5 decades, just one element of a huge body of work that qualifies Sir Malcolm Arnold to be described as a prolific composer, and particularly so when combined with the variety of other work that he was responsible for, and in so many genres. Officially, therefore, welcome to what I'm calling a Sunday of Symphonies. Now, over the next hour or so, we're going to take a rapid trip through each of the 9 separate years, corresponding to the years in which Malcolm Arnold's symphonies were brought to public performance for the first time. We'll be putting the music into the context of world and national headlines as well, relevant in that so much of Malcolm's work actually came from his reaction to the society in which he and we all lived. Naturally, there'll be excerpts from each symphony in turn. We'll also look at what the critics said about Malcolm's work. And if you know about Malcolm Arnold, it wasn't always a happy relationship between warring factions. So saying, let's get started by heading back to the end of the 1940s, and specifically 1949. This was a year when 12 nations signed up to the North Atlantic Treaty. NATO, as a result, was established. The German Federal Republic was established, setting up, therefore, West Germany and setting it apart from East Germany. The Communist People's Republic of China was formally proclaimed by Chairman Mao Zedong, and South Africa institutionalized apartheid. In the Soviet Union, the testing of atomic weapons took place, and of course, from Malcolm's perspective, warlike things really didn't sit too comfortably in terms of his own appreciation of society. Here in the UK, Britain recognised the independence of the Republic of Ireland. Northern Ireland, of course, remained part of the United Kingdom as it is today. Intriguingly, in 1949, they were reading George Orwell's 1984 for the first time and taking an interest in life as a result. When it came to the music of Sir Malcolm Arnold, fascinating things come out when you look at the first symphony itself, and where it places him as a young composer looking for national acclaim for what he did, and at the same time international acclaim as well. And the first symphony really establishes him and an international reputation as a result. We're going to hear a section of it in a moment or two, but what I'll do over the course of the next hour is to take out the information about each of the symphonies, look at what the critics said, and try and put it in context with what was going on in Malcolm's life, and perhaps the emphasis and the inspirations or the overtones of his world that then brought about the music that we've been seeing, of course, from Friday all the way through Saturday, and of course all the way through today as well, up to the very last symphony, which is coming up this evening. If you look back on things like the testing of atomic weapons, if you look at what was going on in Northern Ireland, and if you look at a world that was perhaps on the brink of a great deal of devastation and difficulty, it perhaps sets the context for the first symphony. Malcolm Arnold had already found professional success with the English dances, early chamber music, and of course film scores. 1949 provided an early peak to his early fame. He, of course, conducted the Halley Orchestra at the 1951 premiere of the First Symphony at the Cheltenham Festival. It's sometimes called his anti-war symphony. The critics say this. Musical Opinion was moved to write, "It's the most attractive of the many symphonies by British composers that have appeared in recent years. It has sanity of style, clarity of design, thematic material of distinction, and its scoring is brilliant and original." This is the opening of the final movement. Lots of strident brass and fanfare-like material. You can easily hear, and perhaps see in your mind as well, the military posturing through the percussion section, plus the soaring of the melody. Wonderful soaring architecture and the First Symphony. We move to 1953 for our second look at Malcolm's work. This was a year when Joseph Stalin died, to be succeeded by Vyacheslav Molotov, the foreign minister, the following day. That was in March the 5th. East Berliners rised against communist rule. They were put down by tanks in June. Moscow announced the explosion of the hydrogen bomb in August, and Tito became president of Yugoslavia. Dwight Eisenhower inaugurated as President of the United States in January, and Charlie Chaplin, leaving the United States for good, tainted as an alleged communist. The Justice Department had warned him that any attempt to re-enter the country that year, or any other, would be challenged. Playboy magazine hit the newsstands for the first time. It was a naked Marilyn Monroe that graced the cover. And you might have seen from the national press this morning that one of her dresses had just sold for £500,000. Still interest, therefore. Edmund Hillary of New Zealand and Tenzing Norgay of Nepal reached the top of Mount Everest. And I suppose, musically speaking, for Malcolm as well, something of a summit approached. Francis Crick of this county, James Watson of the United States, and Rosalind Franklin discovered the double helical structure of DNA. You might well have seen the statue to Francis Crick in Abington Street, here in Northampton. And the Nobel Prize for Literature went to Sir Winston Churchill. In Malcolm's musical world, The Second Symphony was written and first performed in the coronation's year. The Second Symphony being a huge success. It made Arnold's reputation on the international stage. It was the first symphony to be written in Richmond, and it's generally accepted to be his brightest symphony, although the slow movement does suggest a certain amount of anguish, and for the first time, perhaps, some of the inner personal uncertainty that would become a feature of his music. Sometimes called his pastoral symphony, the Times said it is a piece of such bold and bright instrumental colours, a welcome and an agreeable addition to the repertoire. The Chicago American was moved to write, Arnold's second venture in symphonic construction is garnished with a genius-touched slow movement, with an anachronistic endive of humour. Great words. The symphony's exuberant finale is a joyous brass engagé with the bare-bone rhythms of a waltz tempo. What you're going to hear is the opening of the symphony, pastoral and dreamlight. There are momentary elements of discord in what you'll hear, but the overall tone, especially through the string section, is of happiness, and with it, Malcolm Arnold's own domestic happiness at living in London with his new wife. Fabulous lyricism and answering from one section of the orchestra to another, I'm sure you'll agree. That's the Second Symphony. We move to 1957 for our third look at Malcolm's work. This was a year when Russia launched Sputnik 1, the first Earth-orbiting satellite. The space age, as a result, really got going in October of 1957. The USSR also tested its first successful intercontinental ballistic missiles, and the world changed forever as a result. It was the year of the death of Humphrey Bogart. It was also the year of the first life being given to West Side Story, Leonard Bernstein's classic. It debuted on Broadway, it brought violence to our stages, and Malcolm Arnold became an avowed fan, as you'll hear from his music a little bit later. Here in the UK, Anthony Eden resigned as Prime Minister. Macmillan would succeed him. And into the Third Symphony, which was commissioned by the Royal Liverpool Philharmonic Society after William Walton had somewhat let them down with his own Second Symphony. It was first played by the RLPO at the Royal Festival Hall in 1957 under the baton of John Pritchard. It's a moving and a very personally serious piece of work, markedly different to the film scores that Malcolm Arnold was writing at the time, including, of course, A Bridge on the River Kwai. The symphony managed to confuse everybody, from critics to fans alike, and it is a very personal symphony as a result. Felix Aprahamian was moved to write as a critic. Once again, the marvellous fluency of the orchestral writing reveals Arnold's ability to think orchestrally rather than simply orchestrate. There is the usual flamboyancy and clarity of texture, and also, in the first two movements, a greater continuity than before. The Observer said, "Mr. Arnold sets out with one great advantage. He is blessed with a melodic fertility that many composers with a large reputation might well envy. And to that he adds an imaginative flair for orchestral colour that is here particularly evident in his handling of the woodwind." Even broadcaster David Jacobs was moved to write in December of 1957, "I welcome this bold, clear music." This is the opening of an angst-ridden, very slow movement. There's a very bleak tone to this excerpt. And graphically, for me at least, if I was scripting this to be part of a film, I think it would be a scene accompanied with a huge camera pan across a vast plain, perhaps almost devoid of colour. In reality, the Third Symphony reflected a time in Malcolm Arnold's life which incorporated the death of his mother here in Northampton. A certain bleakness in the tonation of that particular piece, and if, like me, you see music in visual terms, perhaps you'll understand what I was talking about that very bleak, large camera pan that I would have seen that music accompanying. Let's move forward to 1960 and the Fourth Symphony. World news that year included US Senator John F. Kennedy announcing his candidacy for the Democratic presidential nomination. He wouldn't have long to wait. In May of that year, Soviet surface-to-air missiles shot down an American Lockheed U-2 spy plane. Gary Powers, the CIA operative, was captured and immediately propelled into the headlines. In November of the year, John F. Kennedy was elected over Richard Nixon to become, at just 43, President of the United States of America. Here in the UK, somebody left. Francis Chichester, the English navigator and yachtsman, arrived in New York City aboard his yacht Gypsy Moth II, crossing the Atlantic alone in a new record of just 40 days. Seems like a long time, doesn't it? In December of the year, the very first episode of the classic British TV series Coronation Street was broadcast. It had been planned to be just a 13-part drama. Things have gone on since then. It's now notched up over 1,000 episodes, and of course there are various spin-off series still on our screens. And on the very last day of the year, the farthing, used since the 13th century, stopped being a legal tender in the UK. The Fourth Symphony was commissioned by the BBC and first performed by the BBC Symphony Orchestra at the Royal Festival Hall under the baton of Malcolm Arnold himself in, of course, 1960. It's full of contemporary references, pointedly looking at the Notting Hill race riots, Malcolm Arnold, who was fiercely anti-racist. There are also references to Bernstein's West Side Story, which was getting its first performances in London, and as we've already heard, Arnold was himself a huge fan. Again written in Richmond, Malcolm Arnold now challenged his critics by including popular melody inside the symphony walls. They in turn, as critics, raged against him, and this is how they wrote of his London Symphony. The Times said, "Behind the facade of rumbustious extroversion, the music is disturbed. The ghost of Prokofiev stalks frequently, particularly through the languishing waltzes of the slow movement. The inspiration of Mahler is also discernible in the finale, which swaggers off into a cluster of fugues and is brought up short by a terrifying mob at whose centre is a brass band, evoking vague memories of Alexander's ragtime band. The denouement is all brute force and optimism," and that was in November of the year. What you're going to hear now features what has been described by some as being a grotesque march near the end of the final movement. I'm not sure it's actually that grotesque, really and truly. There are tonal references, I think, to the First Symphony, but maybe that's just me. I do wonder if some of the composition could have given inspiration to the likes of rock group Pink Floyd.
Yeah.
Rock and classical music are very, very closely related, and what you're about to hear could certainly have been incorporated into something like The Wall with ease. Listen out for the transition from the march into something far lighter. In reality, the symphony represented the composer's own, very powerful, anti-fascist statement. They say that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't think that was grotesque at all. I quite liked it, actually. Let's move on again to the Fifth Symphony, and just a few months separated the Fourth and the Fifth. In 1961, it was all aboard Vostok 1. Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the very first human in space, perhaps one of the biggest steps that mankind had ever taken, beating the Americans by just days. Indeed, less than a month later, on the 5th of May, Alan Shepard became the first American in space aboard the Mercury Redstone 3 spacecraft, and we all watched the skies as a result. In August, construction of the Berlin Wall began, restricting movement between East and West Berlin and forming a clear boundary between West and East Germany, Western Europe and Eastern Europe. In October of the year, a volcanic eruption on the island of Tristan da Cunha caused the whole population to be evacuated. I'm not sure that too many air routes were shut, though. The Vietnam War officially began in December of the year as the first American helicopters arrived in Saigon along with 400 US personnel. And in the world of toy making, Barbie got a boyfriend when the male Ken doll was first introduced. Sales went through the roof. Here in the UK, it was quite a legendary year for those of the pop music persuasion. The Beatles performed for the very first time at the Cavern Club. Black and white £5 notes ceased to be legal tender in the UK, and Britain applied for membership of the EEC. The first edition of Private Eye, the first British satirical magazine, was published. And for those of you that have a Northamptonshire background, Diana, Princess of Wales, was born in Sandringham in Norfolk on the 1st of July to her parents, Francis and John. The background to this symphony is that it was written, as I've said, shortly after the Fourth Symphony, and there's something of perhaps a two-fingered riposte to the critics who'd savaged Malcolm Arnold over the Fourth. The Fifth was also written as a memorial to a whole series of friends who had died young, and for whom Arnold painted lyrically musical portraits. The list included Gerard Hoffmann, David Baltengi, Jack Thurston, Dennis Brain, and Arnold's eldest brother Aubrey, who'd taken his own life. It was premiered by the Halle Orchestra under Arnold at the Cheltenham Festival. At the end of the performance, there was a long, sustained, standing ovation. Once again, though, the critics laid into the work, unable or perhaps unwilling to reconcile its tonality, its emotion, and fine tunes. Mind you, the reviews weren't all bad. This is a symphony of love and memories. It's the opening that you're about to hear, heavenly music, after a fairly stark, brief opening. Pizzicato in the strings, a deftness of touch interspersed with a kind of question and answer, particularly from the timpani. I really like this. It leads into his memorial symphony. called Questions and Answers, bouncing between the various sections of the orchestra, and from 1961, the Fifth Symphony. There's then a gap of 6 years before we get to the Sixth Symphony from Malcolm Arnold. In January of 1967, Dr. James Bedford became the first person to be cryonically preserved with the intent of future resuscitation. It's still going on today. And of course, we're about to see a TV programme here showing the mummification of a human being for the first time in 3,000 years. Truly, we were fascinated with our futures. By the way, the mummy is a former British taxi driver. In April of 1967, Puppet on a String by Sandy Shaw won the Eurovision Song Contest for the United Kingdom. Maybe not quite a classic as such. On the 1st of September, it was All Change in Sweden. H-Day brought at 5 o'clock in the morning a change in the way the country drove, because it switched from driving on the left to driving on the right. Nobody said it would be easy, and there were a certain number of accidents. In October of 1967, Che Guevara and his men were captured in Bolivia. The following day, they were executed. A sobering parallel to world events right now. Also in October, Walt Disney's 19th full-length animated feature film, The Jungle Book, was released and immediately became a huge box office hit. It's actually the last animated film to be supervised by Disney himself, and perhaps there's a parallel there to the work of Malcolm Arnold, taking up the baton and of course premiering his music with various orchestras through the course of his career. In December of '67, Christian Barnard carried out the world's first heart transplant in Cape Town, and in France, just a week later, Concorde was unveiled to the waiting world. Here in the UK, at the start of the year, the new town of Milton Keynes was founded, with of course the concrete cows Sunday years later. The first North Sea gas came ashore at Easington in the East Riding of Yorkshire in March. The supertanker Torrey Canyon ran aground between Land's End and the Scilly Isles on March the 18th, and the first automatic cash machine was installed in the offices of Barclays Bank in Enfield in England. Going to the bank would never quite be the same again. For the Sixth Symphony, this was a period of personal happiness for Malcolm Arnold. It was a period of his second marriage, plus a move from the capital to the peace of Padstow and St Merrin in Cornwall. The symphony was written in St Merrin, but it had its debut in London with the controversial Deep Purple and Royal Philharmonic Orchestra concert at the Royal Albert Hall. A lasting friendship with John Lord of the band was established. It's sometimes called his sunny Cornish Symphony. The critics said this. The All Music Guide said that as Six shows, Arnold was as great a symphonist as Tippett or Walton, but a harder, tougher and sharper composer than them. The Sixth has pages of solemn and profound thought. What you're going to hear is the pop music section of the slow movement. There are swirling scales that take the pop music to a very powerful climax. There's lots of syncopation, there's a very fluid sounding brass section, and I challenge you to sustain the time signature throughout. There are lots of demands placed on the strings. There's a real, surreal, dreamlike comment on society here, at least as Malcolm saw it. Absolutely wonderful, and a great performance of it, if I may say so, because I was in last night. Moving to 1973, the change of decade brought with it the United Kingdom, the Republic of Ireland, and Denmark, all entering the European Economic Community, which we all now serve as good Europeans. Later, it became just known as the European Union. Also in January, citing progress in peace negotiations, Richard Nixon announced the suspension of offensive action in Vietnam. A week later, the President announced that peace had been reached and that war was over. In April of '73, the World Trade Center officially opened in New York City, and the following month, Skylab, the United States' first space station, was launched, later to come splashing down again. In October, the Yom Kippur War began as Egyptian and Syrian forces attacked Israeli forces in the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights on the festival of Yom Kippur. And also in October, the Sydney Opera House was opened by Queen Elizabeth after 14 years of construction. She's of course down under right now. 4.5 years after opening, I had my 14th birthday there, singing as a boy chorister with St John's College Choir, and if you ever get the chance to go and see it, take it. It's the most amazing place. Here in the UK, the pilot episode of the longest-running TV comedy series in the world, Last of the Summer Wine, Compo et al., was broadcast. It still can be found on television today. And in November, Princess Anne married a commoner, Captain Mark Phillips, in Westminster Abbey. The divorce followed in 1992. For the 7th Symphony, it was another move for Malcolm Arnold, this time from Cornwall to Dublin. Work on the 7th Symphony started at Ischia, where Malcolm was staying with the Waltons as a house guest. Arnold said that each of the movements was a loose portrait of one of his 3 children. Specifically, the boisterous one is attributed to Catherine, the second, Desolation, to Robert, and the lively third to Edward. There was also a time of intense personal anguish. Malcolm Arnold attempted suicide for the first time. Paradoxically, the symphony got rave reviews, being described by some as one of the greatest ever symphonies by any British composer. It is his Irish symphony forged out of immense emotional stress. The critics said this. Edward Greenfield, writing in The Guardian, "Malcolm Arnold is nothing if not a man of big gesture. His latest symphony represents his biggest musical gesture yet, a massive piece of 3 movements, each of almost Mahlerian proportions." And Piers Burton Page, "It's a blazing masterpiece. It suggests a striking parallel. Here and everywhere else, we hear the utterly authentic voices of an English Shostakovich." For the critics, he got it right. From the last movement, this is another moment of surrealty. Harp and flute leading into Malcolm's recreation of the Chieftains, of course the Irish folk band, which was much loved by his son Edward. There's then some more flute and harp and some very emotional music which comes across, emotion being very much a hallmark of Malcolm Arnold's. You can hear the dancing here, and as the excerpt comes to a close, there's a right change from dark to light, almost on the very last note. moods and humour alike in the 7th Symphony. Let's move to 1978 for the 8th Symphony. In February of the year, the People's Republic of China lifted a ban on works by Aristotle, William Shakespeare and Charles Dickens, all of whom had been seen as subversives until that time. Rhodesia's Prime Minister Ian Smith and 3 black leaders agreed to transfer back to black majority rule, and in March of the year, former Italian Premier Aldo Moro was kidnapped by the Red Brigade's terrorist group. 5 of his bodyguards was killed. Moro's own body would be found 2 months later. In April of '78, Itzhak Cohen and Alpha Beta won the Eurovision Song Contest for Israel with their song Abani Bi. Pope John Paul I died after only 33 days of papacy in September. And in October, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin won the Nobel Peace Prize for their progress towards achieving a Middle East accord. Here in the UK, in April, regular radio broadcasts of British Parliament proceedings started. People were posturing to get their voices heard as never before. In July, Louise Brown, the world's first test tube baby, was born in Oldham. And in September, in London, a poison-filled pellet supposedly injected using an umbrella poisoned Bulgarian defector Gorgi Markov, possibly on the orders of Bulgarian intelligence. He died 4 days later. For the 8th Symphony, it came during a period of personal disarray in Malcolm Arnold's personal life. As well as a breakdown in his marriage, there were multiple suicide attempts in London before a return to London. Attempts in Ireland before a return to London. The symphony itself was composed whilst he was a patient at the Royal Free Hospital, but commissioned by the Albany Symphony Orchestra in New York. The 8th Symphony was the last music that Arnold was to write before becoming a voluntary patient over a 2-year period here at St Andrew's Hospital in Northampton. Although having its genesis in such troubled circumstances, the symphony itself proved highly successful at its American premiere in 1979. It's his energetic American symphony, and this excerpt is from the first movement. It begins with a kind of military mood, low down in the woodwind range, and if you could append a colour to it, I wonder what colour you would describe the music as being. There's a tension to begin with, and then something akin to a military march, played with a Gaelic overtone. It is, of course, the introduction to the IRA tune itself. Tremendous. 8 symphonies, 1 to go. And of course one that has yet to be performed at this year's Festival for Malcolm Arnold. That's about to be changing course this evening. To the final year of the symphonies for Sir Malcolm Arnold, and 1986. This was a difficult year in many ways. It began at the end of January with the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. Just 73 seconds after launch, the Challenger space shuttle blew up It killed the crew of 7 astronauts, including a civilian who was on board for the very first time, schoolteacher Krista McAuliffe. In February, the president of the Philippines, Ferdinand Marcos, went into exile in Hawaii after 20 years of rule. Cory Aquino became the first Filipino woman president. In February, Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme was assassinated on his way home from a family outing to the cinema. His death stunned the entire nation and most of Europe with it. And in April, it was the month of the Chernobyl disaster. A mishandled safety test at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in the Soviet Union killed at least 4,000 people. Radioactive fallout from the accident concentrated near Belarus, Ukraine and Russia, and at least 350,000 people were forcibly resettled. Traces of radioactive deposits unique to Chernobyl were later found in nearby countries across the entirety of the Northern Hemisphere. In June of 1986, the former UN Secretary-General Kurt Waldheim was elected the President of Austria. And in September, Desmond Tutu became the first black Anglican Church bishop in South Africa. In October, during the period of the Cold War, Ronald Reagan and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev met in Reykjavik in Iceland to continue discussions about scaling back their respective missile stocks in Europe. As it is, the talks were doomed to failure. Here in the UK, on the 20th of January, the UK and France announced plans to construct what we now take for granted as the Channel Tunnel. And in April of the year, British journalist John McCarthy was kidnapped in Beirut, only to be released 5 years later. In London, on the 23rd of July, Prince Andrew, the Duke of York, married Sarah Ferguson at Westminster Abbey. It didn't last. So too to the final symphony. After 5 so-called lost years spent between hospital and a troubled family taking care of him, Malcolm Arnold came under the care of former hairdresser Anthony Day, who took him to the tranquility of Norfolk in 1984 and remained his carer for over 20 years. Professionally, Malcolm Arnold started composing again in 1986, quite a gap therefore. The year, of course, saw the arrival of his last symphony. This one is remarkable for its simplicity and perhaps its mystifying scoring. The ninth is believed by many to be a masterpiece, a calm symphony of hope. Bill Pay, writing in Music magazine, said, "Sir Malcolm Arnold's Ninth Symphony is by any measure an extraordinary work." We're going to listen to that extraordinary work, or at least part of it, and the very end of the whole work. And the excerpt begins in an almost funereal way. There is a timeless string melody, finally giving way to a sense of acceptance, and maybe even hope, as the very last chord builds to an end in a major key. It's at this point, almost for the first time in the entire symphony, that the full orchestra actually gets to play together. It's a spine-tingling moment. quite an amazing last chord, and I personally love the semitone turn that the symphony takes just as it starts its journey to the last chord. So deft, so simple, and yet so powerful as well. I would at this point be saying thank you very much for your time, and we'd all be disappearing, but I'd like to suggest a musical postscript. In due course, I'm sure there will be a blue plaque to the genius of Sir Malcolm Arnold. I did in fact investigate it on behalf of the BBC when Paul Harris first came into the studio in time for this year's festival and suggested that perhaps I'd like to take part in it. There will be one in due course, but it's some time to come yet. In the meantime, here's something else to consider. Whilst researching the elements of today's session, I came across something which I can't find detailed anywhere officially. I'm not sure that it's a discovery. You be the judge. There are 8 notes in the musical octave. There's only a finite number of ways in which you can arrange them, but have a think about this. It's believed that Malcolm Arnold had been invited by Stanley Kubrick to compose the score for his science fiction classic movie 2001, A Space Odyssey, but Malcolm declined to do so. In 2000, Ennio Morricone wrote the music for the movie Mission to Mars, itself being seen as an homage to 2001, the movie. Listening to the soundtrack of Mission to Mars, I became aware of something concerning the final chord of not only the Ninth Symphony, but also the movie itself, and I can prove it. It is identical. I leave you with this conundrum. Is this a hidden homage to Ennio Morricone, from Ennio Morricone, to Sir Malcolm Arnold?
Dear God, look at that.
Is that him? Have a great ride, Jim.
You be the judge. Perhaps a tribute, perhaps just happenstance. There is, of course, the evening's gala performance to come, and that live performance of the Ninth Symphony. I commend it to you. Once again, my thanks to Paul and his team for their technical and their editorial help. And thank you for your company in our quick trip around the Ninth Symphony.
Almost a new take on the Arnold Symphonies. What's very interesting, of course, is that Sir Malcolm was very interested in world events. He knew so much about this kind of thing. He was always reading newspapers and involved himself. So I wonder whether there is an interesting paper, or indeed article, or indeed book to be written, looking at Malcolm's work in the context of global carryings on, and we might get even more insight into his work. Fascinating. So John, thank you so much on everyone's behalf. That was excellent. Thank you.